I'm super excited to be here. Like really, totally super excited. Because I think it's so fantastic to see that this conference is happening here. And that is actually here. Like not here, but in Bochum and in the Ruhr area. And I'm really impressed by what the team has pulled off, and it really worked super smoothly. So, well done. And I was like, I'm really, really happy that I can be here to speak today because I've come home. So I was born and raised in the Ruhr area. So that's what it looked like when I was small. It still kind of looks like that. So I was looking for nicer pictures of Duisburg. So I'm from Duisburg. I tried to look for nicer pictures, but all I found was like crappy shots of Szymanski tatorts, which I spare you now. But you know, it never got dark. We could look at romantic skies every day, 6 p.m. when it was dark outside. So, and very important fact, Duisburg lies west of Bochum, which was super confusing to me when I was like listening to the song. West, it's east. So, but now I live in Oslo, which doesn't look anything like Duisburg, as you can see. People are getting ready to ski already. Not me. I have more than 10 years of experience working professionally with web things, and spent a lot more time actually tinkering and contributing to open source projects. Mainly, I started in KDE and then moved on to more web-y things and contributed to Rails Girl Summer of Code. Now I'm joining Vibio as VP of Product, which is why I don't have a laptop, where I will be working on their platform for video production. So we're hiring. If you feel like this looks good, you should find me in the break, like everybody else who's hiring, I mean. Yes. So, but enough about me. Let's talk about complexity. It's a very nice segue from Paul talking about localization and calendars. So when I started my initial research for this talk, I thought I would focus on ways how we who are working on the front end could tackle design challenges that are inherent in complex applications. But the more I thought and read about the topic, and I have read a lot, the more I learned on the job, the more obvious it became that we have to look beyond that. So just to set the expectations, there will not be complexity in mathematics or code complexity. It's a design-ish presentation, but I'm starting from the design point and I'm going far beyond that. So why complexity? I've spent much of my career as a user experience and an interaction designer on products that solve problems related or rooted in complexity. First, I worked at CF Engine. Does anybody know what that is? Hey! So it's the predecessor of Puppet and Chef, so it's way older than that, and the mother of all configuration management systems. So in a nutshell, configuration management systems are responsible for automatically keeping your infrastructure correctly configured. So CF Engine does that via agents. I think Puppet and Chef do that in the same way. Via agents that are running on your servers or hosts or nodes, whatever that might be, and which autonomously watch for changes to system files to either change them back or to update your system. For example, if there is a newer version of a package you run on your Linux distribution, then it automatically updates. And then, up until very recently, I led all design efforts at RDoc. That's a Norwegian startup bringing a data-first approach to governance and compliance. We made a tool, or they are still making that tool, to collect and analyze information and knowledge spread across an organization. So documentation, system documentation, process documentation. So all kind of knowledge and information about people, processes, systems, and how to make sense of all of their interdependencies. So if you're working in an organization trying to get to grips with the upcoming general data protection regulation, everybody's talking about that right now, this is one of the use cases for the application. So I'm telling you this not to give you the sales pitch, but those are complex systems. In both cases, I was hired as the first full-time designer after the teams had been working on that for years, especially in CF Engine. That was the agents and the open source part of it was 10 years old, I guess, when they started the company. Yeah, it didn't have an interface, or a graphical user interface, I should say. It had a command line interface. And both products cover a wide range of different usage patterns, because there is no single way of approaching those tasks, and because the audiences inherently appreciate generalized solution to their problems. So in both cases, we were tackling complex problems to begin with, but I soon started to realize that even seemingly simple applications, I wouldn't say Booking.com is a simple application, but if you just think about the calendar, it shouldn't be that hard. But they pack a punch when it comes to complexity. So I started to take a closer look at the applications that I use every day to learn and to ultimately do a better job and be better at what I have to accomplish every day. So this is a quote from one of the first articles I read on the topic. Complex things will require complexity. It's the job of the designer to manage that complexity with skill and grace. No pressure. I really did not feel well equipped after I read that. So, given that not all of us work on configuration management systems, presumably, how do we get from something that feels rather straightforward and manageable to something that has grown into something we hardly recognize anymore? And how can we reverse this? And ideally, what can we do to avoid the situation altogether? So complexity is a qualitative concept. It always has to be understood in context. So what appears to be complex in one context may not be complex in another. There can never be a general right or wrong way of dealing with it. And what's more, complex tasks remain inherently complex no matter how we approach them. A lot of what we do every day and consists of a range of complex actions, sometimes even spanning several tools or applications. Think of the last time you tried to coordinate an outing with a group of people. How many tools did you use? 3? 4? So I regularly use Doodle, Slack, email, then a calendar. It still doesn't feel particularly complicated or clunky, because what we're trying to do is accomplish a task, and we use whatever it needs to get there. And all of these tools cover a part of that whole range of actions. So we're used to dealing with very complex things and tasks. But we want to try to avoid exposing all of the complexity to our users. So then we may choose to move functionality away from them and automate some of those actions. Basically, then it becomes somebody else's problem. One example here is, for example, the clarify function in most photo apps. So if you take a picture with your iPhone and then you want to edit it or put it up on Instagram or whatever, you have this like tiny little wand. You click it, and magically stuff happens. I personally have not the slightest idea of what it really does, but it works for me. And I suspect that the same result could be achieved by manually adjusting all those properties if I knew what those were and how they worked. But in other cases, we may decide that it's more important to give people full control, or the feeling of full control at least, and therefore make them go through the full range of these actions. So I imagine, for example, it being terribly frustrating for someone who does photo editing professionally, or at least at a higher level than I do, to be limited by this magic wand. So basically, that's the reason why there's Photoshop. And last but not least, products appear complex because of their more extensive feature set. but they are also usually perceived as superior and therefore more valuable, even though it often is counterintuitive. This is especially true for enterprise software, which is what I have been doing for a while now. But we all follow this kind of logic more often than we think. So my example is my washing machine. It has a large dial with all knobs and things. And I knew when I went out to buy this washing machine that I was pretty pleased with the fact that I could run quick cycles and that it had like different things for jeans and like all these other things that it does. But I rarely ever use it. I use a quick cycle and then I set 60 degrees. So I did feel like I got more value for the money that I spent on this machine. So we cannot, nor should we really probably, avoid a certain level of complexity in our products within our specific context. So we need to define what too complex means in our context. But we should be aware of the trade-offs that we're making along the way to be able to somehow reasonably anticipate their impact. But there is obviously a couple of things we can do to manage this kind of complexity and to avoid that whatever we're building gradually turns into a monster while we're adding features. So there's consistency. Possibly the most obvious area and the one we as designers and developers arguably have the most direct control over. This is how consistent the product behaves and looks. Consistency is important because it makes our products predictable in their behavior. The moment we have learned to use an element, we can rely on it following the same pattern, even if we encounter it in a different context. This in turn reduces cognitive load, which is a fancy way of saying that we do not have to think as much about how to use things that are on screen. We can recognize them instead, and consequently are able to use them correctly without much effort. And when executed really well, consistency makes the tool transparent to the tasks, which basically means that it will get out of the way. Once we are familiar with how to use a product, we no longer have to spend any mental energy on it and can focus all our efforts on what we want to achieve. There's a lot of editors who do that really well, we know that. And, but also Jira, if you have configured it the right way, so if someone has gone through the hassle of dealing with all the complicated stuff, and games, but also cars. So just take a moment to think about how little energy mentally you spend on operating the car while you're driving now, presumably you have been driving for a while, as opposed to when you just started. I remember sitting there and just thinking like, right, left, pedal. So this is kind of the golden standard where you want to go. But consistency can be hard to achieve or uphold if several teams work on the product in parallel, or if the code base is large enough and has gone through several stages of design without ever being fully rewritten. Because obviously not all of us have the luxury to constantly rewrite our application to adhere to new learnings that we have. For these cases, we have pattern libraries and style guides and design systems, and Sarah is going to talk about that later today. So I spare you my blurb on this. It's a talk in itself anyway. There's one more thing that might jeopardize even the most diligent efforts for consistency, and that are features that are added in isolation. Sometimes they were initially thought of as a standalone module, sometimes they seemingly solve a purely technical problem, and sometimes they're a result simply of a glitch of the process. Either way, they feel alien to the product, sometimes despite being consistent in look and feel with the rest of the application. Often this is because they do not really fit anywhere in the information architecture of the application, or because they break a flow and make a part of the user journey feel bumpy. We get to that in a moment. Does everybody know what information architecture is? No. Okay, so if you think about a sitemap on a website, someone has thought about where to put all the things. So usually that doesn't happen by accident. Someone has sat down and thought, okay, so we sort the soap below cosmetics, or we sort shoes with male clothing. So that's kind of the concept of information architecture. It's like, where do you place things in a system. That can also mean what elements have to be global and which elements are local to what you're currently looking at. So they're global navigation, they're local navigation. If you think of tabs, they're usually more local, while a menu is a global element. So if you break that, and that happens very easily because it's a complicated thing, we don't really understand what element the piece, like a button, for example, what the consequences of using that button is in the larger system. So every change we make to our products has an effect on pretty much everything else. Every addition removes something else. So I think Fried lists like clarity, testability, maintainability. That's all very technical concepts, but it also removes clarity for the user and in some cases usability because of a larger scope of actions. So in this article, I have the resources in the notes. In this article, Fried argues that we're constantly forced to make trade-offs between the tension of these two extremes, of not adding anything and adding everything. And then we need to be diligent about them. Otherwise, we might end up in a place where we do no longer recognize what we've created. Adding anything is, of course, not per se a bad thing. So we need to grow and evolve our products. Sometimes even adding extra functionality to a feature in favor of increased clarity and transparency is a wise choice. So one of the examples I have that at RDoc we decided to add a manual save button on all forms, even though we had auto-saving functionality in place that we were using other places. What we initially thought was more convenient for our customers, so they didn't have to worry about saving that data because we just took care of it, ultimately turned out to be very confusing to them, because they were just not entirely sure if it was saved or not, even though we had the user feedback in place that said, it's good, moving on. So although it wasn't strictly necessary in that case, adding this extra functionality made our application easier to use because it behaved in a more predictable way. So the user felt in control of what was going on and understood that if I press the save button, everything will be saved. While it's often possible and smart to decouple functionality and to organize our code base in a modular way, our UIs have to always be seen as a whole. So almost all tasks are embedded into a larger journey that spans across several areas of a product, and making changes to any step might break the flow for our users. When I talk about journey, it's like you start at some end with, for example, the idea of booking a hotel room. Then you have a couple of tasks that you need to accomplish until you finally have the hotel room booked and checked out and paid. That is one user journey. Within that user journey can be several flows where you have smaller tasks, like what Paul talked about in the calendar, that you have to pick a date and then you have to confirm the date and you have to make sure that the prices are right. So that is a flow that needs to kind of hang together. So the larger the application is and the more we wish for modularity, the more diligent we need to be to make sure that those journeys and flows are intact. So we can make our own lives easier with dealing with this inevitable internal complexity. In almost all cases, we can prioritize flows. Like, I am pretty sure that Booking.com has their checkout flow quite high in the prioritization list. And then we can optimize a manageable amount of happy paths that we want our users to be able to continue through without being disrupted in any way. That way, we allow everybody to efficiently complete their main task without us having to constantly worry about everything and all the implications anything might have in our applications. The bad news is that task flows or journeys are often interconnected in some form of network rather than behave like linear progressions. We are just not as well organized in our heads as we think we are. So this means that in a larger application, paths through the application converge and diverge again at different stages. Which brings us back to the trade-offs. So in some cases, we inevitably have to trade improved maintainability and testability against some bumpy areas for a small group of people trying to progress through a rare combination of actions. We obviously should evaluate these trade-offs on an ongoing basis, or, well, we shoot ourselves in the foot, basically. This is from my first tech employer after I stopped singing basically. Trolltech, those are the creators of Qt. That's a C++ framework. Use this one as their guiding principles for API design. APIs obviously expose a different kind of interface to their users, but the principle applies to the design of most products that have grown beyond a very, very narrow scope. The internal complexity of any application has a direct link to the decisions that went into creating it. Early decisions set the constraints for all following iterations on the product. This is the case for technical decisions, which database you choose, for example, as well as design decisions on the very high level of the user interface design. Every change, every addition to the product has to fit with what is already there if we do not want to rewrite our applications over and over again. This is the main reason why it's so much more fun to build something new rather than taking over something that has grown and lived for a while. So the more decisions we have taken early on, especially those where we haven't holistically considered their implications, the less room we have to maneuver. Something that felt like a simple, straightforward solution to a narrow problem may suddenly set tight boundaries for how we can solve a more intricate problem somewhere else. This is almost impossible to avoid when we operate in a space where we don't see clearly for more than 6 months ahead. So the startup I just came from didn't have the luxury of knowing exactly where they went when they started out, so they made a lot of decisions that had very, very strict constraints for the team later on, and that needed to be tackled. So we had to retrofit earlier work to make it play nicely with later iterations based on what we had learned along the way. And to make this less common and less painful, we need to start talking about scope. Everybody's favorite topic. And this is something that has taken me a very long time to really understand. Scope and complexity are in many cases two sides of the same coin. Scope ranges from defining the boundaries of your product down to the details of every single feature. There is no scoping, though, without fully understanding the problem first. We tend to be very familiar with the fact that we have to be sure we fully understand a technical problem before we start defining a solution. But the same applies to our users or customers' problems. They often appear clear just to reveal layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of hidden needs once we start researching and talking to our users and customers. So what we often hear first when we talk to customers is a feature request. I want this to do that. What we really need to look for is, why is this the thing they're asking for? Because usually this is not what they actually need or want. Well, this is a quote from an article published by Intercom recently, where they describe their product development process. In this article, which is very humbly titled, "What the Best Product Managers Do," Adam stresses how much time his PM and design teams obsess, which is his word, over their customer's problem. Every problem goes through several iterations until they're confidently they really have nailed the problem. They're not talking about any solutions there. They're only talking about what the problem is. And sometimes that means that they have to pull features back from beta stage into another round of research because they are not sure that what they made actually solved the initial problem, that they understood the problem correctly. So the research and design phase is where they spend the bulk, I think it's like 80% they're talking about, of their time. So let that sink in just for a moment. 80% of their time, which means 20% of their delivery time. It makes total sense once you start thinking about that, but it's something we easily underestimate, especially if we, as designers and developers, primarily look at our work from a perspective of execution and delivery. That's where we rightly should focus our efforts. But ultimately, we need to do, or someone needs to do, this hard work so we can properly scope and prioritize reliably in the first place. And once we understand that what this idea really means for the way we work, it becomes increasingly clear that what drives prioritization is not our solutions, but the problems we have defined and researched. Because ultimately, we cannot make good, sustainable decisions when we do not know what we're really trying to solve. And I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but this is really hard. So this is, I think, a pretty bold statement calling for some kind of absolute purity. There is no absolute purity. Reality is much more messy. So, and one of the reasons for it to be more messy, and also I had to learn that the hard way, is often that we have a very fuzzy idea of where we want to go with what we're doing. So if complexity increases with scope, and scope is what sets our product's boundaries based on our understanding of our users' problems, then how do we know which problems are within the scope of our work? If you think about the calendar again, that could solve all problems in the world just by making all the bells and whistles, but what they try to solve is just making booking hotel rooms easy. So we cannot possibly solve all our problems for everyone in our audience. So the answer of that obviously is some kind of vision. There's no way we can scope work or prioritize problems or manage complexity without clearly knowing for where we want to go with our product. Because only then we can decide how we get there. Usually, because we had at the JavaScript conference, we're in a position where developing and maintaining that vision and setting the goal for the project or the product we're working on is somebody else's job. Either it's a product manager or it's a product owner somewhere in the organization you work, or it's a client and they don't necessarily know what they want to do with this either. But in either case, I would like to encourage you to ask about the vision or the motivation for the project you're assigned to. And those can be, again, as we heard this morning, very uncomfortable conversations because you have to ask the hard questions and you need to be prepared to somebody not having the answer. Because understanding it will improve the quality of the decision making, and you're making tons of decisions every day on very low level. And consequently of your work then, and it will make your life just much easier because it takes some of the guesswork out of it and a lot of the reworking that we have to do constantly because we misunderstood what the initial idea was. So, in conclusion, complexity is a qualitative concept that depends on its context. Complex products are generally perceived as superior and therefore more valuable. Consistency helps mitigate complexity in interfaces. And unlike our code, experiences can only be designed as a whole. Complexity and scope are two sides of the same coin. Just like scope, complexity needs to be actively managed on all levels, from the inherent complexity of a feature to the complexity of the entire, and that's why I say brand experience, because it goes even further than the application in some cases. And we cannot sensibly scope or design an acceptable level of complexity without clear product vision. And I'd just like to leave you with this, because I find this very interesting. It's an exciting design challenge, making it look powerful while also making it easy to use and attractive and affordable and functional and environmentally appropriate, accessible to all, said by Don Norman, one of the godfathers of interaction design. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.